So, we're done with the first part of getting to know our shapes. It's so super introductory, and the second part may contain useful jokes even for those who are feeling and I have been for days. The market often operates with templates and proven solutions, because this machine does not sleep and needs content. Therefore, some of the tabs that will be discussed, I started poking much later than my start in the profession. Somehow the hands did not reach. So it happens, you sit for 10 years in the program, and then you watch a student stutter and such, and what was it possible? And that is why, at least in words, I want to say the main features of the neck player, so that later, on occasion, you can always get it out of memory and apply it somewhere in practice. Let's see what's what. As I said in the author effect, there are several ways to create neck players. Let's talk about one more of them. If we go to the preview window of our composition, right-click, go to the New tab, then we can find the player in the drop-down menu here. Okay. After we created the neck player, we see that we have created essentially a current anchor point. I also said before that a shape is a layer. It's just that we can add various primitives to this layer. If you expand your player now, we will see that the Content tab is empty. So we just don't have any primitives or lines here. I created this shape in such a way to talk about this very cool tab called Ed. Although it is small, but it hides quite a lot of cool settings. Let's take it in order. Well, first of all, we can create groups. Again, as we remember, there can be any number of different primitives on one layer of neck players. That is, we can mix it all, put it in different groups, somehow tag each other, well, and get the result. We will not create a group yet. Next setup. Here we see three main primitives and pathos, the free creation of some kind of shape. Why are there three of them here at all? Here in this tab we have 5 of them. Because actually the rectangle creation tool, it actually duplicates the rectangle creation tool with rounded edges. That is, we can create a rectangle and round the edges in the settings. And also the tool polygon tool and star tool are also essentially the same thing. We can change the shape of the polygonal shape to the shape of a star, and inside the starter we can change the shape of the shape from a star to a polygon. Therefore, in this tab we have polystar here. That is, in fact, these are the same of our primitives as in this tab. Well, probably, the Adobe people just thought that it would look somehow poor if, after pressing the left mouse button, we would see only 3 values here, but they also made 5 at once. Let's go back to the Ed tab and add some shape, let's say in a square shape. But in fact, this is only a representation of the boundaries of the shape itself. If we select, for example, a selection tool and click somewhere to the side, we will see that our shape is not displayed anywhere. In order for it to appear in the preview window, you need to assign it either a fill or a contour. To do this, we have the following tabs of fill strings. Adding a fill, adding strings. In general, this is how we created such a regular shape. One of the advantages is that he is in the center of our composition, that is, his anchor point is in the center of the composition. One of the disadvantages is that the author of the effect does not immediately assign and bind an additional field with transformation to this shape. Let me explain what I'm talking about. Let's say I'm going to create a rectangle next to it, a second shape. I'll go to the content, open the tab and see that we also have the path of this rectangle, lines, fill, but there is also a transformation tab with which we can, as we remember, move, resize. I will delete this shape. In order for this shape to have the same tab, we still need to create a group and shove all the elements into this group. And then we will see that our group already has exactly the same transformation settings. In general, a little more steamy. Let me slightly change the size of our square, the thickness of the string. So that in the future it will be better to see the following things that we will talk about. Well, in general, these tabs are not the main ones, and we are talking about them only in order to show some additional possibilities for creating a shape. We are interested here in these 10 parameters, which I call effectors. In the future, we will go through the Blue 4D and talk about the effectors that are in the Blue 4D. Well, of course they are different from the effectors that we have in Russia, but still there is some similarity. Let me tell you about them in order of popularity. And for me, the first lists are an effector repeater. But I think the word repeat is familiar to many of you. A repeat is a repeat. Let's choose a repeater, and here it's actually better to get it out of the group. Pull it out somewhere. A little lower. The whole joke, by the way, is that there is some kind of reverse hierarchy in these effectors, in the shapes. If we have a repeater on top, it will not affect our shape in any way. That is, everything below some elements, it affects this element. Although the author of the effect is the opposite story, everything above the layers, it affects the lower layer. In general, I don't know why they decided to do this. In general, it probably doesn't bother anyone much. Let's talk about the repeater. As we can see, the fact that by default he created 3 copies for us. The copy tab is responsible for this. If we change it, we will increase the value of copies that are created based on our main shape. The next tab is offset. We can shift our copies relative to the x-axis. It is strange that we cannot shift these copies further relative to the y-axis. But it doesn't matter. The next tab is responsible for how the copy will be located. Either they will be placed in order one after the other, or if we change, the next copy will overlap the other. I hope it's not super difficult yet. Let me reduce the number of copies and move it somehow. That's it. That's it. Next comes the transformation tab of these copies of ours. You can move copies relative to the anchor point, you can move copies along the x-axis, you can move copies along the y-axis. In general, it's cool, because such a fake 3D effect is created. With this, you can come up with something and stir up some fun background. Let me tilt it a little. Next tab. This is a scale. Well, here it is clear, an increase in size. But the size will increase, so to speak, step by step. That is, as we can see, not all shapes increase immediately in size, but the shapes increase alternately. You can also create some cool effects with this thing. The next tab we have is rotation. But, accordingly, we twist our shapes. It is also a step-by-step system, that is, not all shapes are spinning. The first shape shifts by one number of degrees, the second one after it by some more relative to the first, and so on. Well, the last 2 tabs are the initial transparency. We can create such a conditional trace. Well, the decrease in transparency by the end. Something can be done about this, too, but, perhaps, according to the repeater settings, that's it. But, as we understand, we can create another repeater. And if it is placed below our first repeater, then we can already duplicate not one of our shape squares, but the previous repeaters. So you can create more fun and complex backgrounds by creating multiple copies. It is also often used. Well, that is, I usually use either one repeater or 2. I don't get into the next jungle of copies of copies. Okay, the repeater is sorted out. We delete it. The next most popular I think is that there is a trim paths. I'll add it and look at it for some settings. In general, in most cases, trim paths is added only to the stroke, to our lines. Usually fill is disconnected in this case. I'll explain why later. That is, when we need to animate the appearance of our string, our stroke, we often use this thing called trim paths. There are not so many meanings here, it's easy to figure them out. Let's just twist the start value. We will see that if we change the value from 0 to 100%, we will sort of erase on the shape. In the opposite direction, we will do the same. Accordingly, the end value, the neck will be erased in the opposite direction. And you can somehow animate and twist them at the same time, while achieving different results. Plus, you can change the value in the set. This will actually mean changing the starting point of erasing our string. Why am I saying something that is usually used only under strings? Let me turn back on the fillet, fill the shape and see how it works with the fill. In general, it erases the fill in a specific way between, as it were, the points of the ends of our stroke. Well, this is not always applicable and not everywhere, although of course you can use it. Stream pathos, I think, perhaps, everything. It's pretty simple and, well, understandable. But let's move on to the next parameter. The next most popular for me is wiggle paths. Let me appoint him. We will immediately see the changes in our shape. Wiggle paths essentially transforms, bends the boundaries of our shape. If we twist the size, we will see that we can split the shape. In general, in fact, to splinter it somehow. You can change the details here, that is, how often we will have these peaks, either very tightly, or choose very small values of deformation. Next, we are setting up how sharp the peaks of deformation will either occur, or they can be made smooth. Rounded, smoothed. Well, to get already such a more organic form. But if we, for example, want to make some kind of bacteria or, I don't know, some kind of jelly, this can generally be used easily. What's the joke? The fact is that by default our wiggle puff already has an animation. Here she is represented by wiggles seconds. Well, how many times a second will there be sausage in our blob? Let me press the space bar and see what happens. In general, we see that somehow, randomly, according to some algorithm of our own, our shape begins to spread in different directions. Well, if we increase this value, then of course it will be pulled much faster. Let me go back to the small values again and move on. To be honest, I don't really understand the meaning of correlation. Purely visually, if you change these values, it is not entirely clear what it does with our shape. But I do know one thing, that if I set the value here 100% now, then I will get this effect. Let me try to increase the size of our deformation at the same time. It seems to me that this value of this correlation makes the deformation value of these sharp peaks more correct. But, accordingly, if we put the correlation value closer to 0, then the blob will be even stronger. Mom, don't grieve. So. Here, of course, you can experiment with this thing and get some interesting effect by twisting these parameters. Moreover, We do not need to put keys, just changing the value for ourselves and just wait until something cool appears on the screen. Let me put the correlation on the value of 50% again and move on to the next tabs. The following values go under the name temporal face and hurried face. It sounds like a face, but it's actually a face. In general, using these two values, we can change the initial shape of the deformation of our shape. To be honest, when everything is already crooked, it doesn't really matter how crooked it is in one direction or the other. I use these sliders very rarely. Well, random sleeps. This, accordingly, we can also change the initial curvature of our shape. If you suddenly did not like the way the author painted it, the effect is automatic. In short, Beagle Pav. Cool stuff. We will definitely try to use it somewhere, apply it. Well, rather, it may even be not quite something random, inarticulate, in the style of some kind of dangling blob, and we will use this parameter to make a meaningful and intelligible animation. Demolish it. And let's move on to the next most popular effector. It is called Weigal Transform. We add it and see what we have in it. By default, it also has its own animation, that is, the number of wiggle operations per second. In order for something to start moving, we need to go to the Transform tab. That is, the transform has disappeared, there is its own Transformation tab. We can change the position, we can change the scale, and we can change the ratio. And now click play and see what happens. In general, we see that the wiggle transform randomly affects our shape object and randomly changes the value that we changed. If I change the scale by 0%, then, accordingly, our square will twitch only by position and by the ratio parameter. Well, we can also take the ratio to 0 again and our square will randomly move only by position. Which is cool. Again, you don't need to put any keys and you don't need to prescribe any additional express trains. Just change the value of position, scale, ratio, well, we get the result. With this tab, I also think, perhaps, everything. The next most popular thing for me is the zigzag tab. Of course, I would like something like this to happen after clicking this tab. Then I would use it much more often. Let's expand our zigzag tab. As we can see, when we have already applied it, we have changed. The shape of our shape has changed. It does approximately the same thing as wiggle pause, only it changes the shape of the shape more correctly. That is, it does not randomly squeeze out some peaks, but changes in the shape occur evenly along its contour. Let's try to change some values and see what they affect. Well, everything is simple here. The size is the size. We can split the shape stronger or weaker. Let's, by the way, I'll reduce our lines to make it more clear. We also have a masonry regis per segment. It is responsible for the density of the change of this purebred. Accordingly, the greater the value, the more teeth we have. The smaller the values, the fewer they become. Cool. You can also create various interesting shapes and shapes with small values, just without making any effort. It looks quite fashionable. And accordingly, of course, it's cool to animate all this. Well, the last tab is also responsible for smoothing the corners. The corner is the sharp corners, and the smooth is the smoothed ones. super stylish cart. You can work with her and do just as much as becoming a peak on Vimo. Okay, we've gone through the zigzag too. Cool stuff. We drove on. The next effector, which I discovered not so long ago, is called Packer and Blad. Let's apply it and see what it does. In general, it has only one parameter, and by twisting it we can see how it changes our shape. You can also create right awesome stuff with it. It affects different forms in different ways. You can try to change the shape of the shape and apply a Packer Blad to it and see what happens. You can, by the way, mix all these effects. Let's say initially we will have a zigzag. Let's change some values. And we'll get something like this. Cool element. The UFO Packer is my discovery and I just want to do something in it. Just super. I like how it deforms shapes. Del. Let's move on. Well, probably the next most popular for me personally is the corners round. In principle, everything is clear here. He smooths out our corners. Again, one setting and, accordingly, you can use this effector to influence the angles of your shape. Either smooth or not smooth. I'm already a little tired, but we only have 2 effectors left, so let's talk about them faster. In order to demonstrate clearly how the next effector works, I will take it down to a shape and create it. Let's assume such an object consisting of 2 shapes. As we see in this case, the upper shape overlaps the lower shape and we see its boundaries. And we need, for example, to create one single shape without these internal borders. To do this, we have the following effector. Select the Content tab, go to the Ed tab and add the Merge Puff effector. Cool. The effector has been added, our objects have become unified. There are different ways to combine objects in Merge PAF. If you switch between these tabs, you can see how our objects are subtracted or added. The insert, for example, leaves the shape only at the intersection of the shapes. In short, it's a cool thing. If you want to create something more complex in complex shapes, sometimes they even help out a lot. Well, if we finish drawing something here, then the next shape will also fall under the influence of our effector. In short, the tool maximizes usability and sometimes, of course, saves a lot of time so that we don't dance with a tambourine, achieving the necessary results. Well, one more nuance, the fact that the merge path pulls up a common string and a common fill. That is, now we edit the thickness, color, line for all shapes at the same time. I will remove our effector and extra objects and leave one rectangle. Let's immediately disable the rounding of corners in the settings. Go to the Ed tab and go to our last effector. It is called Offset Paths. If we add it and reveal its parameters, we will see that there are not many of them here, firstly, which pleases, and secondly, let's understand them. The first parameter is simple. We change the value of the impact force and see how this effector affects our shape. In fact, it enlarges the shape along its contour. Convenient in order to create all sorts of transit transitions. The second line is responsible for how our object will behave after being exposed to our effector. Let me click on the tab and see we have three different options. The first is miter join. In fact, nothing changes. We zoom in on the neck simply relative to its shape. Let's choose a round of join and try to change the value of the M mount. Now we can see that the more we affect the shape with the effector, the more it is rounded off. It's cool, because you can do various morphing. You can also do some more tricky transitions, where our curtain will turn from rectangular to more rounded. Well, the next tab we have is bevel joint. In fact, our corners will be cut off. And it also looks cool. You can somehow combine all this and achieve some interesting result. And finally, for fans of complex detective stories, I will tell you about another setup called the minor limit. I twisted it for a long time and tried to understand what it can affect at all, since there are no visible changes. I go to the hook pot up extremely rarely and most likely when a gun is only pointed at me, so I tried to figure it out on my own. Well, I started with the most logical. This is the translation of the word miter, thinking that this would somehow be able to shed light on what is happening. In general, miter translates as miter. It was already too late to retreat and I decided to punch the word mitra through the search. The first option that Google offered me was this, miter. A deity of Indo-Iranian origin, associated with friendliness, justice, contract, consent and sunlight. It turns out that this setting is responsible for the degree of influence of this deity on your project. I believe that if you increase the value towards infinity, then perhaps your project will gain the strength of justice and harmony. And most likely the power of the earth. The official Adobe support rejected this information, so I had to dig deeper. And I found out that if we turn on the miter joint parameter and move the miter limit value by 1, we will get exactly the same result if we turned on the miter joint bevel joint place. Well, for me personally, the first version is much more interesting, so I'll choose it for myself. Well, this is probably the end of the conversation about our shapes. In the following lessons, we will definitely use some of these effectors in practice and make something cool out of the shapes. That's it. See you in the next lesson. For now, conversation about our shapes. In the following lessons, we will definitely use